Another Trump shakeup this week, this time on the president's legal team, as the frenzy surrounding the Mueller probe reached an even higher pitch in Washington. John Dowd, the president's lead lawyer in the Russia investigation, resigned this week, just days after Trump hired veteran Washington attorney Joe diGenova. The president told reporters at the White House Thursday that he'd like to testify before special counsel Robert Mueller, something Dowd had argued against. We're back with Dan Henninger, Bill McGurn, and Wall Street Journal columnist Kim Strassel. So, Kim, how do you read the Dowd resignation? Was it fundamentally about that strategy difference?
I think there's a strategy difference. I think there was also just a frustration on Mr. Dowd's part. He was frustrated that he didn't have more control over the president. He had asked the president, his entire legal team has asked him not to go out there and be texting and complaining about the Mueller probe in public. Obviously, the president has been ignoring that advice. But look, I think there's an opportunity here, Paul, in that a lot of people have wondered if this existing legal team is the right one in terms of what we're hearing might come out of the Mueller probe. For instance, an obstruction charge.
Right.
And you might want some lawyers around you that are much more prepared to deal with the constitutional questions of something like that, and have a strategy that's designed to counter. And it wasn't clear that this legal team was doing that. So this could be a moment for a shakeup that better positions the president.
Bill, the Dowd concern was that if you put the president in with Mueller, let's face it, the president, you never know what he's going to say. Right. And you never know what he's going to remember. And he may say something that he believes is absolutely true and is entirely false.
Yeah, lawyers love that stuff, right? I mean, I'm not a lawyer, but every lawyer I know would tell you not to do this, right, because you open yourself up.
But the president doesn't believe that. He believes, hey, I can handle anything. So, I mean, I guess he's going to, what do you think? Do you think Dowd was right?
I mean, I think you have to look at two parts with Donald Trump. One, I think he has a legitimate concern that he feels he didn't do anything. He didn't do anything wrong. There are people trying to overturn an election or at least make his administration so illegitimate.
I concede all that.
But I think it's important to concede that because it's a big thing to be working against a presidency this way. How he handles it is another matter, you know, the tweets. And, you know, the lawyers don't seem to have much control over him.
Well, but that's the point. I mean, Trump can believe all that and come in there with absolute certainty. But ultimately, what he says, Dan, can be something that trips him up. I mean, we have personal friends who still believe that they told the truth, and they ended up getting indicted for making false statements.
Well, one good example of someone who did not get indicted but went through this process is Ted Olson.
Right.
The Supreme Court solicitor, former Justice Department official, who, when he was in the Reagan government, was investigated by an independent counsel, Alexia Morrison, became a very famous Supreme Court case. It was a nightmare for Ted Olson. And the Trump team has reached out to Mr. Olson to see whether he would join them. He declined. But nonetheless, there's an awareness that dealing with a special counsel like Robert Mueller is a dangerous enterprise. On the other side, there is Donald Trump, who thinks he has been wronged, and he doesn't want those kinds of lawyers selling him out, so to speak. I think he's brought in someone like Joe diGenova to essentially be kind of the bad cop, the guy who's going to lean on the system and make sure that Trump's personal interests are represented here, and that the lawyers dealing with Mr. Mueller don't make a deal that puts the president at jeopardy.
All right, Kim, let's turn to some other news this week on the Mueller probe and the Russia issue, and that is the House Intelligence Committee Republicans, the majority, released their report, initial report on what they discovered. What did we learn? What are the highlights?
Well, this matters first and foremost, Paul, because it's the first of any congressional committees to actually finish up a probe on this. They put out both findings and recommendations. And I think the top line answer is here. They did not find any evidence of any collusion between the Trump White House and Russians in any way. That's the important thing. They did identify a number of holes in our system that the Russians have been able to exploit. And I think this is important because we want to be looking forward here, not just back. And that is very much what the Intelligence Committee has been trying to do. And what's extraordinary is the depth and the breadth of the number of people they interviewed and went through. This was a very thorough investigation in the end.
All right, Bill. And in another move, momentum is building for something I know you don't support, which is the naming of a second special counsel, this time to investigate how the FBI and Justice handled Hillary Clinton's email investigation, among other things.
Right. Look, the idea is that DOJ and FBI are resisting all these efforts to investigate themselves. Again, remember, under Donald Trump, Rod Rosenstein at Justice and Christopher Wray at the FBI tried to make an end run around the Intel Committee, and they only coughed up some documents because they were threatened with contempt.
Do we need a special counsel?
I don't think we need special. The problem with special counsel, if it's really special, it's unconstitutional, right? And if it's not special, what's the difference? I think what we do need is for Congress and the president to exert the levers that they have. For example, there's impeachment. If the FBI director doesn't cough up the documents and is really resisting, they could use that. There's a lot of legislative tools that they have. President Trump baffles me by not assigning someone at Justice to do as we've recommended, to disperse information, since it mostly vindicates it.
I have to say, I think the political momentum is building for that special counsel. We'll see what the Inspector General report that we're all waiting for says, and if it says something that there was some real bad behavior, then I think we'll get a second special counsel, notwithstanding advice. I agree with you, your advice. All right, President Trump following through on a campaign promise and hitting China with tough tariffs. How the markets and Beijing reacted to Thursday's announcement. Next.
And we don't want that to happen. We're not going to let that happen. It's probably one of the reasons I was elected, maybe one of the main reasons.
President Trump making good on a central campaign promise Thursday and slapping tariffs on nearly $60 billion worth of Chinese imports, a move meant to punish Beijing for what White House officials say is a pattern of economic aggression that has robbed U.S. companies of millions of jobs and billions of dollars in profit. The Dow plunging more than 700 points in the wake of Thursday's announcement as fears of a trade war increase. We're back with Dan Henninger, Bill McGurn, and Wall Street Journal editorial board member Mary Kissel. Mary, what do you make of the tariff announcement?
I think it's a very dangerous game, Paul, because you never know when you start a trade war where it's going to end. And the Chinese have already said that they're going to impose tariffs as well on states that, by the way, are important to Trump's base, most notably agriculture.
But you worked in Hong Kong, as Bill did, as I did, and you know from covering China that they do discriminate against foreign firms. So is there a point here, unlike maybe with steel tariffs, that Trump is actually seriously addressing, a real problem with China?
In other words, does China commit, quote-unquote, economic aggression, as Trump said? Yes, the answer is yes, they absolutely do. They steal intellectual property. They have state champions that get subsidized loans from state-owned banks. So, yes, Trump has a point. The problem is, as we've pointed out in innumerable editorials, is that you want to put in place a system that doesn't harm American businesses and American consumers. And to be frank, that's a difficult challenge. How do you punish a country that's such a large part of global trade without also punishing American consumers at the same time?
Dan, Mary raises a good question. How do you do that? Because there's no question in my mind that China has been guilty of bad behavior. And even, I've talked to many business executives who operate over there, and their point, they said, we go over there with enormous optimism, and for a while things are opening up. The last few years, it's gotten really tough, and they're coerced to turn over trade secrets, intellectual property, and the regulatory system is rigged to get them to do that. How do you address that if not with tariffs?
Well, you start with the understanding that doing anything is an enormous undertaking. The entire developed world is now deeply invested in China. It is very difficult for them to extract themselves from those commitments. That said, you're going to need a strategy. And a strategy is not what exactly looks to be on offer here from the Trump administration. I mean, to take on China in any sort of targeted way is going to require the support of our allies, Western European nations, the other nations that trade with Europe. But you roll this tape back about 10 days, and the president was threatening to impose tariffs on the European Union. Now, it may look like they're being exempted at the moment, but what are they supposed to think about the United States trade strategy? One day it's on, another day it's off, and now it's targeted at China. And so I think the president at this point is really heading for an uphill battle in trying to do a negotiation with China, because I suspect he's not going to have that much support from, say, Australia, South Korea, Japan, or the European Union.
All right. What do you make, Bill, of the market response? Down in a big way. And if you look at what the market's done since the tariff began on steel, since the trade initiative started, the momentum from tax reform has really ended.
Right. No, I think this is, I don't think the president sees this, but I think this is a break with his pro-growth tax reform policy. Look, as we were saying, China does cheat. We all know, we've seen it. But it's very hard to hit them without hitting yourself. It reminds me of someone shooting a gun in a small constricted place, and it ricochets all off the walls. I think China exports $1 billion worth of steel to us, but we export $13 billion of soybeans to them.
Right.
Who's going to? So I fire at you, China, and then you, the farmer, gets hit. It's just and you know.
But is there a real economic risk here?
I think uncertainty is what the markets fear most, right? And trade wars are among the most uncertain. I'm a hawk in everything except for trade wars. And it's the definition of uncertainty, because you do your thing and you expect them to do one thing, but they could branch out into completely different areas.
I do have to maybe play devil's advocate a little bit. No one forced these companies to go over and do business with China. And a lot of these CEOs, I'd note many of the financial institution CEOs, were cheerleaders for China's authoritarian regime, and they thought they had great connections and they'd get a different kind of bargain. And then they woke up 10 years later and realized that their intellectual property
but if you're a
was stolen.
CEO, how in the world were you going to say, oh, I'm going to ignore the China market?
There are several large Fortune 500 companies that have not gone in there, Paul. And you know what? I have sympathy for them that they had their intellectual property stolen, but I also don't want to let them off the hook, because they should have gone on clear.
But the other thing is, you had an arc of reform in China, and with Xi Jinping and his predecessor, immediate predecessor, it stopped.
It started
and they've gone backward. But so I mean,
it's also this phony argument on trade deficits. People that don't understand how these numbers are put together. Our former boss, Bob Bartley, said the way to fix the deficit problem is to stop keeping statistics. You know, you look at, just take Hong Kong, Taiwan, and China. What Hong Kong and Taiwan did is export their deficits to China, because the way they value something is the last person that puts something into an iPhone, they get the full cost of it. So the bulk of the value can be from somewhere else, but China gets stuck on it.
And that's literally true in the case of the iPhone. All China does is assemble it, and yet it's counted total value as part of the deficit. All right, when we come back, Facebook under fire. CEO Mark Zuckerberg promises changes after data from more than 50 million users was harvested by a data analytics firm with ties to the Trump campaign. So is big tech getting different treatment than it did in the Obama years?